What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, we are having a look at one of Magnus Carlsen's latest online blitz games against the speed demon himself, Daniel Naroditsky. Now, this game was played on January 5th, 2025. There were a bunch of games played today between these two titans, but this one takes the cake, so enjoy. And here we go. In the game, Daniel opens 1e4. Magnus goes e6, the French defense. Kind of a rare guess at the highest level, but, you know, Magnus plays virtually everything these days. All right, d4, d5. Now, the main lines, of course, are knight c3 and knight d2, but instead, Daniel does go e5, the advanced variation. And I have to say, the advance is becoming a lot more popular at the GM level. It avoids a lot of long forcing lines, and a lot of players are playing it instead of knight c3 here. All right, here, Magnus, it continues. c5, obviously the main move. Then we have c3, knight c6, knight f3, and here the main line is bishop d7, and that is what Magnus goes for. So, bishop d7, the main line, opting not to go for the alternatives, including, say, queen b6, a6, and knight g7. All those are playable, but instead, bishop d7 played in the game. All right, Daniel, he continues. Bishop b2, then knight g to e7, a very typical move for black, intending maybe knight f5 later in the game. That would be a good square for the knight, putting a lot of pressure on that pawn on d4 along with the other knight. Now here, Daniel, the main line is simply short castles, but he throws a little bit of a curveball, and he does play the move knight to a3, jumping to the edge of the board with that knight. Now, the idea being you want to go knight a to c2 later, and from c2, that knight will support d4. That way, white can counter black's pressure on d4 with those two knights, with two knights of his own. All right, now here, Magnus, knight f5, the main line, freeing up e7 for the bishop. That way he can go bishop b7, short castles, and then maybe f6, fighting for control of the center and knocking down at that pawn on e5. All right, now here, Daniel, he continues. Knight c2, so far so good. Now Magnus takes on d4, c takes d4, c takes, bishop b7, and finally Daniel does castle. Short castle. So this is move 10 so far, and so far we have basically blitzed through these moves. It's a very typical advanced French defense situation. Black's got some pressure on d4, but white has that more than sufficiently defended with those two knights and the queen on d1. So obviously d4 will not be falling anytime soon. Now, here, again, the main line for black is simply going to be short castles, then f6, biting down at the top part of that pawn chain on e5. And now, instead of that here, Magnus Carlsen, as promised, as shown in the thumbnail, on move 10, he plays just an insane move. I don't even have words for this move. He plays the move g5. Now, this move is technically dubious. It is not a good idea. Yes, that pawn on g5 is defended by the bishop and the queen. Therefore, it is playable. White obviously cannot take, as he only has two attackers versus those two defenders on e7 and d8. But playing g5 this early is, it's very committal, and is not really clear if black is going to be able to attack on the king side, where overall he has a little bit less space thanks to white's very strong pawn on e5. So a very ballsy, gutsy decision by the former world champion and apparently tied for Blitz world champion, but I digress. All right, now here, Daniel, it's a very critical point in the game. So far he's played basically flawlessly, no mistakes at all, and now he's got to find a plan. Obviously, g5 is g4, sorry, is the threat here. Do you want to allow that? Well, it turns out you can allow it. You can also go g4 immediately, driving back that knight. The computer says g4 is actually the strongest way to play. The point being, you want to go g4, then after knight h6, you go h3, supporting that pawn on g5. Instead here, knight to e3 played in the game, and this move does allow potentially a future g4 advance, perhaps after h5 first, and that is what Magnus does. So, h5, obviously you can't go g4 right away here, as that would lose the pawn on g4 to the knight. That is one of the ideas of knight e3 in the first place. The other idea being potentially trading on f5, but that would be a very double-edged decision. All right, Magnus, he continues. h5, gaining space on the king side, and now what is Daniel Naroditsky going to do? Well, he does trade on f5 here. That is the strongest move. So, knight takes f5, damaging black's pawn structure. Now Magnus recaptured the e-pawn. E takes f5. And now look at this. We've got three, super powerful pawns on the king side. They're not exactly pass pawns, but oh boy, those pawns are going to be rolling down the board, threatening the white king. And this whole game is going to get extremely crazy from here on out. Trust me on that. All right, now Daniel is white. How should he be continuing? Well, in this position, he's got a few different moves. The computer says, no matter what you do, you got to push the pawns down the board. It says H4, B4, and A4 are all the best moves. I mean, all of these moves look insane to me, but that is what the engine is saying here. In the game, Daniel does go H4, gaining space. Magnus, he has two options, taking on H4 or going G4 himself. If you go G4, knight G5 will be the response. That would be relatively good for white. So instead here, Magnus, he takes on H4. G takes H4, taking that free pawn. Of course, now the pawn on H4 is defended by the bishop and the queen. White's knight certainly cannot take that pawn. And beyond that, Magnus is going to have various attacking ideas, maybe based on rook HG8, maybe, I don't know, rook G4, rook G5, maybe queen C7, long castles, and then bringing the other knight all the way to the G8 square. So overall here, Magnus is going to have, like, a lot of different attacking ideas, and Daniel, he's got to watch out. Not to mention the idea of maybe even H3 at some point, try to, again, open up more lines in the king side. All right, Daniel, how should he proceed? Well, according to my friend Stockfish, king to H1 is the right move here, stepping off the open G file, or the semi-open G file. The point being, you can go rook G1 later in the game, maybe bishop F1 and so on, supporting G2, and overall, that would be the best defensive setup against black's ensuing attack. Instead here, bishop F4 played in the game, a decent square for the bishop, not a bad move per se. The bishop does sort of defend this diagonal here that might be useful later in the game, so not a bad move, just not the best. All right, now, Magnus, rook G8, very good move. Again, getting that rook on the semi-open G file, very, very strong. And now, Daniel, how should he respond? Well, once again, king to H1 is the right way forward, but instead here, he goes king to H2. Now, this move at first glance looks somewhat logical. I mean, it's a decent square for the king. It kind of supports G3 if needed in certain scenarios, but the problem is the king is a little bit more vulnerable on that H2 square instead of H1. Yes, white can still go rook G1 in the future defending, but overall, that is just a little bit too dangerous for that king. All right, here, Magnus, he plays a very aggressive move here. Rook G4, flying in with the rook, getting that bishop on F4. This is what we're talking about. Now here, Daniel, does he want to defend the bishop? Does he want to go back? What's it going to be? Well, the strongest move is queen D2, defending that bishop without moving it. Instead, bishop to E3 played in the game. And this move is actually a very significant mistake. As you can see by the eval bar, kind of skyrocketing down there. Magnus has maybe the advantage for the first time in this game. Instead, queen D2, as you can see by the eval bar, would have maintained a roughly level game. Instead, bishop E3 played in the game. Now Magnus, he exploits the problem with this move immediately. That is simply the move F4, advancing the pawn one more square, hitting the bishop, and effectively forcing it to go back. So, bishop D2 played in the game for Daniel, and now look at his pieces. I mean, the knight not doing a whole lot, the bishop's kind of blocked in on E2 and D2, the rook's sort of out of play, the queen again not doing much, and again, Magnus has that very simple plan. Queen C7, long castles, rook D, G8, and so on, piling up pressure. And if white ever moves the knight, I don't know, knight to E1, knight to G1, threatening that rook, because of the weird pawn structure on the king side, black may even be able to leave that rook on G4 and offer the exchange sacrifice after bishop takes, then H takes, recapturing towards the center with the pawn. So that may be one idea. All right, Magnus, queen B6, flying out with the queen, pressuring D4 and pressuring B2, and setting up long castles. Very good multi-purpose move. All right, Daniel, how will he defend? Well, it turns out the only good defensive move here is heading into a slightly worse endgame with the move queen to B3, offering that queen trade. Now, fortunately for us, the queen trade did not occur. Instead, bishop C3 played in the game by Daniel, and this move is it's a little bit passive. The bishop is now effectively a giant pawn. Yes, it does defend D4 and B2, meaning you're not losing more material here, but overall, that is not a very inspiring bishop. All right, here, Magnus, as expected here, long castles is the move, getting his king to safety. All right, knight to E1, jumping back, putting pressure on that rook, and as discussed here, black actually does not need to move that rook. He can just leave it there. The point being, if white ever takes, black takes back with the H-pawn, and suddenly that attack is just like rolling down the board with his pawns, and that is what Magnus does here. Rook D to G8, by far the flashiest move available, leaving that rook, and it turns out actually moving the rook would be quite a bit weaker. So not only is it flashy, this is the strongest move by far in the position. All right, now here, can you drive that knight back with, say, I don't know, f3? Turns out, no, you cannot. That would be a massive mistake. It weakens the kingside dark squares just too much. Black retreats, and the attack continues. h3 is coming, and so on. That would be a disaster on the spot. So instead, bishop to f3 played in the game. What is the idea behind this move? Well, I'm not really sure. Let's keep going. Bishop e6. Both sides making bishop moves that I don't fully understand. All right, rook c1. Developing the rook. I understand that. Attacking the king on c8, and black simply slides out of the attack. King to b8 played in the game by the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. And by the way, guys, I just realized the timers were not on the screen, so I went ahead and just added those timers to the game, and we're going to keep going here. So, queen to a4 played by Daniel in the game, sliding his queen out, putting a lot of pressure on the queen side. Now here, Magnus finds the best move in the position. You know what? If you like puzzles, try and find the right way to continue the attack for Magnus Carlsen right here in this position as black. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this one. All right, here, the key idea for black is the move h3, opening up lines on the king side. Now here, no matter what white does, he's going to be in a world of trouble. For example, if you take that pawn on h3, g takes h3, the rook can move. There's going to be a lot of pressure. Maybe you want to go rook h4, pressuring the pawn. And likewise, if you take the rook on g4 with the bishop, that was played in the game, then obviously black just recaptures with the h-pawn, h takes g4 played, and again, those triple pawns on the king side are, I mean, they're going to be so hard to stop. All right, Daniel, he tries his best, g3, trying to defend on the king side. Of course, black's going to have the option of going maybe f3 at some point, locking down the king side, but for now, he wants to keep the attack going. So, bishop g5 played in the game, supporting that pawn on f4. Now, obviously, if white takes on f4, g takes f4, then black recaptures with the bishop, and that would be just devastating for black, opening up that diagonal. You don't want to allow that. So instead, rook d1 played in the game. The point being, you want to get out of the way of the discovered attack of the bishop. If you don't play rook d1, then the move here is simply f takes g3, hitting the king on h2, and you have the discovered attack on the rook on c1. You lose the rook and the game. Therefore, here, Daniel, rook d1 played in the game. All right, now Magnus has many different ways to proceed as black. The strongest one is actually bishop d7, setting up the threat of potentially knight takes e5 with the discovered attack on the queen, as the bishop would be defended by the new knight on the e5 square. So, bishop d7, getting rid of that queen on the a4 square would be very dangerous. Instead, a slightly different bishop move was played in the game, bishop f5. The point being, well, let's play one more move I'll show you. Here, Daniel, knight d3, and here the point of bishop f5, Magnus goes bishop to e4, cutting off this diagonal. What do you want to call it? The walls are closing in on the white king. That's the phrase. They're finally closing in on him. All right, now here, knight c5 played by Daniel, fighting back. Bishop f5. Of course, that bishop was under attack by the knight. And now here, of course, Daniel, he sort of has that option of going for a draw by repetition. I'm sure the GOAT would not go for it. You can go knight d3, hoping for bishop e4, then back to c5, then back to f5, and so on. That would be a draw by threefold repetition. But of course, this is an online blitz game. I mean, whether you win or lose, it's not that big of a deal. So, of course, both sides are going to play on. Instead, bishop d2 played in the game, retreating the bishop. Now, here, Magnus, he plays just an insane move. I don't have words for this move that he played in the game. He played the move knight takes e5, giving up the knight. Now, it looks very logical after all. If white takes back on e5, then you win the knight on c5, winning the pawn effectively, and that is what happens. D takes e5, then queen takes c5, but the problem, at the end of this sequence, white regains a pawn, bishop takes f4, and look at this. The attack here on the king side is almost completely over. There's just no way to effectively open up lines. Now we have bishop takes, queen takes, and again, how are you going to open up lines on the queen side, or the king side, sorry? Maybe somehow if the queen got to, I don't know, e4, then g2, that would be dangerous, but obviously that is a pipe dream at this point. So instead, bishop e6 retreats the bishop and supports that pawn on f7. Now, rook c1 hits the queen. Queen b6 sliding back, then rook to c2, defending that vulnerable pawn on b2. Now, very importantly here, Daniel, he's not only fought back, he's a little bit better in this position, as believe it or not, his king might actually be a little bit safer than black's. I mean, white's going to have a lot of threats against the black king very, very soon. And beyond that, all of black's pawns, especially the ones on f7, d5, and g4, are quite vulnerable. He will have to spend a lot of time defending those pawns as this game progresses. All right, rook d8, sliding over the rook, try to defend. d5 in advance is Magnus, but this turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Rook d1 puts more pressure on that pawn. Now here Magnus, a6, giving his king some loft on a7 if it needs it later in the game. There will be no back rank mating threats, is what Magnus is saying. All right, now rook d4, sliding up with the rook. Rook to c8, sliding over. Then we have rook takes, king takes, and then queen to d2, sliding back with the queen. King b8 gets the king off the open c file. Then we have queen to b4, offering the queen trade. And here Magnus, he cannot resist the idea of heading down into an endgame with the queens off the board. So queen takes, then rook takes, and then king to c7 played in the game. Now we have rook to f4, sliding over, keeping as much pressure on those pawns. Now, very importantly here, Daniel, he has the extra rook versus the bishop and the extra pawn of black. That means Daniel is a little bit better, but keep in mind, Magnus has a whole whopping 2 minutes left in this game versus the 35 seconds of Daniel Naroditsky. That's going to give Magnus very good chances to pull away with this game. All right, now here, king to c6 played. Then we have f3, and it turns out f3 is a little bit of a mistake. Instead, a3 intending b4 was the right way to go. Instead, f3 played in the game. And now here, Magnus, he takes on f3. G takes f3. Now Daniel goes g4. That was his idea, trying to block the bishop's defense of that pawn on h3. Maybe he wants to go king takes h3, rook takes f3, and so on. But of course here, black's going to have counterplay. And here he plays the move d4, getting that pawn rolling down the board. Now, instead of that, f2 would have been a little bit stronger, but the same idea. You want to get those pawns rolling as soon as possible. So d4 played in the game, And now here, the strongest move is simply rook takes d4, as these pawns on h3 and f3 are going nowhere. You simply don't have to worry about them. Instead, king takes h3 played in the game, and this move throws away almost all of white's advantage. And now it is roughly an even endgame here, according to Stockfish. All right, king d5. Magnus knows in the endgame you got to centralize that king. Then we have king to g3, king takes e5, winning that pawn, rook takes f3, and then bishop takes a2. Now, b3, trying to trap that bishop, of course. Bishop takes b3 is not possible, as then the rook wins the bishop. Instead, f6 played, the Ben Feigl counterattack, and now rook f5 hits the king, king e6, rook f3, and then a5. Magnus is playing for counterplay on the queen side, the idea being b5, then a4, getting a pass pawn potentially on the a file. All right, king to f4 played, and then sure enough, b5, then king e4 and a4. Magnus showing his idea. Now we have king takes d4, winning that pawn. Daniel once again down a single pawn, but he has the extra exchange, the rook versus the bishop. He's still doing just fine. Now here, Magnus, bishop takes b3, winning that pawn. He now has two protected pass pawns on the queen side. Can Daniel hold on? Rook e3, king f7, king c5, heading for the weak backward pawn. Now we have bishop c4. Of course, the move a4 is not possible, as then the bishop hangs and you lose the game. So, bishop c4, defending, and now black has sort of a fortress going on the queen side here. All right, now, king b4. Jumping back with the king, stopping a3 ideas from that a pawn. Now, king g6, rook f3, bishop b2 is the rook f2, bishop takes g4. Now, very importantly here, Daniel Naroditsky, he has very little chance of winning this game as he has no more pawns left, so he's mainly fighting for a draw here. So, he starts king takes b5, winning that free pawn, then bishop d1, and then we have king to b4 sliding back. Now, f5, and here Daniel plays just an insane looking move at first glance unless you understand your king and pawn and bishop endgames. Here he goes. Rook takes f5, giving up his rook for a pawn. What is the point? Well, Daniel here knows against Magnus in this position, he has no chance of getting a win. Therefore, he simplifies to a theoretically drawn position. Here's how it works. Rook takes, then king takes. Both players continue playing here. These are real moves. Then, king a3, bishop b3, king b2, king e4, king a3. And here Daniel, he knows, with the bishop and the pawn, when the bishop does not control the queening square, if you just get your king down to that square, it is a draw. And here are the rest of the moves. King d3, king b2, king d2, king to a1. And now there's no way for the king to get closer without effectively having a draw. Here, Magnus, he just goes king to c2, trapping the king. The king can't move as the bishop controls a2, the king controls b2 and b1, and for that reason here, both sides are immediately forced to agree to a draw on the spot. Wow, what a game play between Magnus Carlsen and Daniel Naroditsky on January 5th, 2025 on the chess.com servers. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below what you thought, what you liked, what you didn't like, and so on. And while you're at it, I got a game right here where Daniel Naroditsky played maybe one of the best games he's ever played against Magnus Carlsen. If you want to see a really cool game between Daniel and Magnus where Daniel just shows up in, like, full power, check that game out, and I'll see you in the next video.